To survive as a machine gunner was to be called lucky. It was a lie. The lucky ones spent their nights staring at the ceiling. They saw the same image. Hundreds of men falling in neat, bloody rows. Physical survival was merely a stay of execution for the mind. 10 years later, these survivors would still be screaming in their sleep. The heavy breathing of a gunner is the only sound in the mud. He is the primary target. Every sniper, every grenadier, and every charging infantryman has one goal: kill the man behind the trigger. Before the Great War, the dream of firepower looked different. General staffs obsessed over volley guns. These were crude clusters of barrels lashed together. One pull of the lever sent a wall of lead forward. Then the machine died. Reloading took minutes. The volley gun was a one-hit wonder in an era of muzzle loaders and muskets. It was a mechanical dead end. It lacked the one thing that would soon turn the 20th century into a slaughterhouse. The weight of what came next stayed with the gunners forever. The cost of survival was hidden in the crosshairs. Physical safety meant mental ruin. A machine gunner's eyes saw what no man was designed to witness. The attack begins. A wall of men moves across no man's land. The gunner presses the thumb triggers. The Maxim screams. Rows of soldiers collapse like wheat under a scythe. Hundreds of men. One finger. One continuous burst. The barrel grows hot. The air fills with the smell of ozone and burnt oil. The gunner watches faces through the sights. He sees them fall. He sees them stop moving. There is no time to mourn. There is only the cyclic rate of fire. At night, the adrenaline fades. The silence is worse than the noise. Those who survived were called the lucky ones. It was a lie. By the 1920s, psychiatric clinics across Europe were filled with former gunners. Their hands jerked in their sleep. They were replaying the harvest. One man kills 500. He sees 500 ghosts every time he closes his eyes. He is a victor on paper. He is a wreck in reality. The position itself was a death sentence. The gunner fires until a bullet finds his skull. He slumps over the cooling jacket. The loader shoves the body aside and grabs the grips. The survivor's mind shattered from what they saw in the crosshairs. But 62,000 men never had the chance to go mad. The British Machine Gun Corps was not a career choice, it was a countdown. Why did the military fill these elite ranks with the condemned? The statistics left them no other option. 170,500 men entered the Corps. 62,000 left it in bags or on stretchers. The soldiers had a name for their unit. They called it the Suicide Club. Elite status meant a death sentence. To execute defense in-depth tactics, teams operated far in advance of the main trench line. They were isolated, static, exposed. A machine gun nest was a magnet for every heavy shell and sniper round on the battlefield. When a gunner fell, the replacement stepped over the warm body to grab the grips. He knew exactly where the previous man had been hit. He knew the next bullet was already flying toward the same spot. Total casualties represented more than a third of the entire Corps. It was the population of a small city erased. Germany tried to shield their own meat with steel. They issued the Sappenpanzer. It was a heavy, multi-layered lobster shell of trench armor. It stopped low-velocity fragments. It deflected jagged shrapnel. But at close range, a direct rifle hit punched through the plate as if it were tin. The armor weighed 24 pounds and failed against a standard Mauser round. Surviving the steel plate was only the first threshold of the nightmare. Inside the nest, the machine gun team lived in a state of constant, rhythmic terror. It was a factory of death where the workers were also the primary targets. 40% of all battlefield fatalities came from these barrels. But the price of such efficiency was paid in the crew's sanity. The gunner gripped the handles, eyes fixed on the sights. To his right, the loader fed the belts, his fingers dancing centimeters away from the reciprocating bolt. Behind them, a chain of men hauled ammunition, water, and steel through the mud. The Vickers and Maxim were thirsty. 2 entire infantry companies did nothing but haul water and brass to keep the line from collapsing. After 2 minutes of sustained fire, the water in the cooling jacket began to boil. Steam hissed. Clouds of vapor gave away the position to every sniper and mortar crew in the sector. What happened when the water ran out? The crew unbuttoned their trousers. They urinated directly into the gun's cooling jacket. The stench was unbearable. A thick, cloying fog of cordite mixed with boiling urine rose from the weapon, stinging the eyes and coating the throat. Every hour, the barrel glowed a dull red. It had to be swapped. The gunner pulled the white-hot steel out with asbestos mitts while the enemy rushed the gap. Stoppages were a death sentence. In the trenches, mud and grit were everywhere. A single jammed casing turned the squad into sitting ducks. They scraped at the mechanism with bleeding fingernails, clearing the debris in a frantic race against the approaching bayonets. Every second the gun stayed silent, the enemy gained 10 meters. The crew didn't just fight the enemy, they fought the entire landscape. Every machine gun nest was a lightning rod for steel. As soon as the barrel spoke, the hunt began. A Maxim gun was the first thing every battery commander wanted to erase. Artillery didn't just fire at trenches, it calculated coordinates to bury the nests under tons of earth. If the shells missed, the snipers didn't. They watched for the slight movement of a cooling jacket or a flash of a muzzle. One bullet to the gunner's head, one to the feed mechanism. The gun falls silent, the line breaks. Isolation was the primary fear. German stormtroopers moved like ghosts through the smoke, carrying nothing but bags of grenades. They didn't attack head-on. They circled. They crawled to the flanks and the rear. A single stick grenade tossed into the pit turned the crew into red mist in 4 seconds. Then came the mechanical monsters. In September 1916, the British unleashed the first tanks. These armored boxes were built for one purpose: to crush barbed wire and roll over machine gun nests that bullets couldn't reach. The crew heard the clatter of heavy tracks long before they saw the steel hull through the fog. The rattling of the chains drowned out their own fire. The world wanted them dead. Yet the standing orders remained absolute. No matter the shells, the snipers, or the tanks, the crew stayed in the hole. They fired until the metal warped or the last man stopped breathing. The command was simple: hold the position to the last round. 3 million casualties in a few months. That was the price of the first 60 days. The death of a single crew had been a tragedy, but by late 1914, the statistics had descended into madness. The map of Europe didn't just change, it bled. Battalions marched shoulder to shoulder across open fields as if the 19th century had never ended. They walked directly into the path of the Vickers and the Maschinengewehr 08. Why didn't the war end by Christmas? The answer weighed 60 kilograms and stood on a tripod. The math of the slaughter was precise. The British Expeditionary Force landed with 2 machine guns per battalion. The Germans arrived with 6 per regiment, 1 gun for every 750 men. By 1918, that ratio would collapse to 1 gun for every 50. In September, the Battle of the Marne claimed 500,000 lives in a week. The German army pulled back to the Aisne River. They didn't just stop, they dug. Both sides then lunged north, trying to get around the flank. History calls it the race to the sea. In reality, it was a crawl through the mud. Every failed maneuver pushed the line further toward the Belgian coast. By November, the movement stopped. Look at the horizon. A line of raw earth now cuts the continent in two. It starts at the snowy peaks of the Alps and ends in the salt spray of the North Sea. Engineers and infantrymen carved 25,000 miles of trenches into the soil. It is a distance long enough to wrap around the entire Earth at the equator. This was no longer a battlefield. It was a factory of attrition. Machine guns and heavy artillery became the new rulers of the wasteland. Generals led these men into battle as if they were fighting for Napoleon. The result was a massacre. By 1914, the technology of defense had outpaced the speed of the human heart. It was a collision of centuries. 19th century tactics met 20th century machinery. How did a pre-war battalion move? They advanced in rigid, linear formations, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of meat and wool. A thin screen of skirmishers ran out front, but the main force followed in dense, predictable rows. The manual was simple: suppress the enemy, inflict casualties, and wait for the opposition to waver. Then came the climax of the theory, the bayonet charge. Cold steel was supposed to deliver the final blow to a broken enemy. But the enemy wasn't broken. They were dug in. Contrast this, a mass of bunched men versus a single water-cooled barrel. One side had courage and leather boots. The other had rapid-firing artillery and barbed wire. The math of the bayonet died in the first months of the war. The field remained littered with those who followed the old rules. Empty horizons, mud. No one moved. Generals drew arrows on maps. Engineers drafted zones of total destruction. The industrial age transformed the battlefield into a geometric grid. Tactics shifted from courage to calculation. On some sectors, the density reached 30 machine guns per kilometer of front. This wasn't a line of defense, it was a wall of lead. Can you kill without aiming? Grazing fire did it automatically. The weapon dictated the pace. It was too heavy for a single man to carry into a charge. A standard Maxim required a crew of 4 to 8 men. They functioned like a factory cell, feeding the belt and cooling the jacket. Because of this weight, the machine gun became the ultimate king of the trench. The setup followed a lethal pattern. Commanders placed nests every 250 yards. They cleared the ground of every bush and every stone. They poured concrete for pillboxes and strung miles of barbed wire. Then came the math of the beaten zone. Quote, "Physics prevented every bullet from hitting the exact same spot. Vibration and wind created a cone of fire. When the rounds landed, they formed an elliptical impact area. This beaten zone was a precise oval, only 2 meters wide. Within 600 meters, the trajectory stayed parallel to the earth. This was grazing fire. A lethal corridor where no bullet rose higher than a man's head. If you stood upright, the math of the trajectory intersected with your chest. At this range, the machine gunner no longer looked for individual targets. He simply maintained the geometry of the zone. Anything that entered the ellipse ceased to exist. The beaten zone remained exactly 2 meters wide. If the grazing fire was a wall, then enfilade fire became a meat grinder. The geometry of the trench was no longer a shield, it was a corridor of death. Machine gunners did not aim at individuals, they aimed at the line. One bullet fired in enfilade did not stop after the first kill. It tore through the first soldier, then the second, then the third. One pull of the trigger, 3 bodies. Engineers laid barbed wire in belts 15 meters deep. They did this at night. The wire did not just stop the advance, it funneled it. Infantry moved toward the only open gap. That gap was the center of a pre-registered kill zone. How did the geography of the front become a trap? The mud finished what the wire started. Shelling turned the earth into a liquid graveyard. Rain filled the craters. A soldier tripped in the dark. The mud sucked at his boots. It pulled him down. He did not die from a bullet. He drowned in the soil of France. The guns worked in pairs. This was interlocking fire. If one gun jammed, the neighbor took over. The coverage remained seamless. It denied safe access to 3 kilometers of the battlefield. There was no flank to turn, no cover to find. Artillery caused 60 to 70% of all casualties on the Western Front. But the machine gun was the precision instrument of the stalemate. It turned the act of walking into a suicide mission. The machine gun claimed 40% of all battlefield deaths. When it became clear the trenches were a grave, armies tried to take death into their own hands and run. The era of the stationary iron monster was over. Military engineers looked at the 300-pound Maxim and saw a relic. They needed a weapon that could breathe, move, and kill on the march. How do you force a machine gun to attack? The Germans simply welded a handle to it. They took the massive MG-08 and stripped it down. They added a pistol grip. They bolted on a wooden rifle buttstock and a bipod. This was the MG-08-15. It was a Frankenstein of engineering. In the middle of a heavy machine gun sat a pistol grip, a desperate attempt to make the unyielding manageable. The weight dropped to 48 pounds. Imagine sprinting into machine gun fire while carrying a fully packed suitcase. That was the German light solution. It was still a water-cooled anchor. It clutched at the mud. It slowed the assault. In the heat of combat, the 0815 proved that mobility couldn't be achieved by just adding a handle. Then came Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis. He abandoned water entirely. His design used a massive aluminum shroud to suck cold air across the barrel. It worked like a radiator. No water jackets, no hoses, no heavy tanks. The Lewis gun weighed 28 pounds. This was a revolution in steel. It carried a circular pan magazine with 47 rounds on top, looking more like a record player than a weapon. For the first time, one man could carry the fire of a whole squad. It broke the chains of the tripod. Infantry no longer had to wait for support. They carried the support with them. Soldiers stopped kneeling and started advancing. They pulled the triggers and fired from the hip. The most mass-produced automatic weapon of the Great War became its most hated. French engineers created a weapon for the breakthrough. Instead, it betrayed its owners. They called it the Shosha. It was supposed to be the future of mobile fire. Light, lethal, accessible. A hollow click followed by silence. That was the sound of the Shosha in the mud. The design defied logic. Its 20-round curved magazine featured a massive open slot on one side. The goal was simple. Let the shooter see his remaining ammunition. The result was fatal. Did the soldiers appreciate the view? Rarely. The open gap acted as a vacuum for the filth of the Western Front. Mud, grit, and stagnant water poured directly into the firing mechanism. Contamination caused 75% of all stoppages. It fired slow, 250 rounds per minute. This made it easy to control, but the engineering was a death sentence. Under ideal conditions, the gun jammed after 300 rounds. In the trenches, it died after 100. You do not trust your life to a machine that fails after 5 magazines. The tragedy deepened for the arriving Americans. They received a version converted for the .30-06 cartridge. This modification made the weapon even less reliable than the original French model. While French soldiers cursed their jammed shotshots, one man in America was drafting the future. His name was John Moses Browning, a legend in steel and springs. Could a single engineer break the deadlock of the trenches? The answer lay in Browning's safe. He ignored the failing French designs and built something entirely new: the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR. It was 3 pounds lighter than the Shot. It was air-cooled. It was reliable. A gas-operated beast firing the powerful .30-06 cartridge. Browning gave the infantry a choice: semi-automatic precision or a 500-round-per-minute torrent of lead. But the Pentagon was terrified. They saw the BAR's perfection and froze. They feared the Germans would capture a specimen and copy the mechanism. So, they hid it. The brass kept the weapon away from the front lines, stockpiling crates for a massive 1919 offensive. An offensive that never happened. This weapon would eventually save thousands of lives, but only in the next global war. The BAR remained a highly guarded secret until the armistice. While the Americans struggled to make the BAR a functional machine gun, the Germans pivoted. Trench warfare had reached a dead end. Victory no longer lived in the open field. It lived in the dark, narrow tunnels of the front line. The Stoßtruppen moved first. Elite stormtroopers. They didn't carry heavy rifles or slow Maxims. They carried the MP-18. This was the birth of the submachine gun. A machine pistol chambered in 9mm. It was designed for a single purpose: high-speed slaughter at point-blank range. These squads struck like lightning. Allied soldiers heard a burst of fire. Then the Germans were already in the trench. It wasn't war. It was a chaotic, mechanical massacre. These steel barrels defined the face of the next global conflict, but they were forged in the filth of the first. By 1918, the lesson was clear. The era of water-cooled monsters was ending. Mobility became the only way to survive. The MG-42 and the M2 Browning would later perfect this lethality. But the foundation was laid here, in the mud. The Great War ground to a halt as the empires collapsed under the weight of their own inventions. On November 11, 1918, the firing stopped. General Friedrich von Bernhardi wrote the manual for the coming slaughter. He claimed the machine gun was a defensive tool for lesser nations. In the colonies, it mowed down thousands. In Europe, the elite believed their superior will would simply shatter the bullets. Why were they so certain? The doctrine of élan vital stated that a soldier's spirit outweighed any mechanical fire rate. August 1914. The sun baked the rails as millions of men moved toward the borders. Generals leaned over oak tables. They drew thick arrows on maps of Belgium and France. The brass clinked champagne flutes in Berlin and Paris. They promised the boys would be home by Christmas. It was a war of maneuver, of speed, of short, decisive strikes. Then the guns of August opened fire. A single Maxim gun team sat in a shallow pit. The water in the cooling jacket began to bubble. 600 rounds per minute. One gunner pressed the thumb triggers. The belt hissed through the feed block. Opposite them, a wave of infantry rose from the grass. They wore bright uniforms and carried fixed bayonets. The bullets did not care about their bravery. The lead sighed through the first rank, then the second. The war of maneuver died in a ditch within weeks. Pre-war theorists had predicted a clash of heroes, but they delivered a massacre of statistics. Every major power ignored the warnings from the Russo-Japanese War. They bet the lives of an entire generation on a romantic lie. By December, the trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the sea. The general's 4-month victory turned into a 4-year funeral. The doctrine of the offensive collapsed under the weight of 5 million casualties by the end of the first year. While the brass buttons of general staffs gleamed in war rooms, the factories of 3 empires were already forging the same machine of death. It was an international franchise of slaughter. 1 patent, 3 flags, millions of identical funerals. The German Empire chose the MG-08. It fed on 7.92mm Mauser rounds. Across the wire, the British responded with the Vickers. It was a masterpiece of endurance. During one operation, a single unit maintained sustained fire for 12 hours straight. They burned through 100 barrels to spit out nearly 1 million rounds. The mechanism never jammed. The Vickers outlived the empire it served, remaining in British service until 1968. Its career ended with a full military funeral. The Russian variant emerged from the Tula Arms Factory. It was a heavy 7.62mm beast mounted on a distinctive 2-wheeled cart with a steel gun shield. These machines were designed to kill the subjects of the Kaiser and the Tsar. Yet they shared the same mechanical DNA. The design was so effective, it refused to stay in the history books. Today, the same silhouettes appear in the trenches of the Russo-Ukrainian War. 100 years later, the Maxim still kills. While the world copied Maxim, France took a different path. They refused the water jacket for one reason: the Sahara. In the desert, water is more precious than ammunition. A water-cooled machine gun is a liability when your theater is a furnace. The French army needed a weapon that could breathe. They chose the Hotchkiss. Why remove the water? In the deep desert, there is simply nowhere to get it. The design was brutal. A thick, heavy barrel, no jacket, no cooling liquid. Instead, the engineers carved deep cooling fins near the breech. They looked like steel ribs. These rings were designed to bleed heat into the thin desert air. The physics were punishing. During rapid fire, the metal absorbed the friction of every bullet. The temperature climbed to 400 degrees Celsius. In the twilight, the barrel would begin to glow, a dull, menacing dark red. Unlike the recoil-driven Maxim, the Hotchkiss relied on expanding gases to cycle the bolt. It was lighter, it was simpler. But the trade-off was the feed system. The Maxim swallowed belts of 250 rounds. The Hotchkiss was fed by rigid metal strips, only 24 rounds per strip. It required constant, rhythmic loading, a mechanical heartbeat that broke under the pressure of a massed charge. Despite the limitations, the weapon became a staple of the Great War. When the American Expeditionary Force landed in Europe, they did not bring their own machine guns. They carried the Hotchkiss into the mud of the Western Front until their own domestic designs were ready for the field. The French feared the desert heat, but the British already knew how to handle the Maxim. They had turned the African colonies into a laboratory for industrial slaughter. 1,500 dead for 4 losses. This was not a battle, it was an execution. In 1893, 700 men of the British South Africa Company moved through the bush. 5,000 to 6,000 Ndebele warriors watched from the shadows. The British had only 5 Maxim machine guns. It seemed like suicide. The Ndebele launched a surprise night attack. Shadows screamed and rushed the perimeter. Then the Maxim spoke. A heavy, rhythmic thudding drowned out the cries of the charging men. Muzzle flashes lit the tall grass. The warriors fell in rows. The machine guns mowed them down like a scythe through wheat. By dawn, the field was a carpet of bodies. 1,500 warriors lay dead. The British lost only 4 men. 4 Britons against 1,500 warriors. 1 week later, at Dembesi, the Ndebele tried again. 2,000 riflemen and 4,000 spear-wielding warriors charged the British line. The Maxims did not jam. The lead curtain remained unbroken. 2,500 more men died in the dirt. In South Africa, the hunters became the prey. The Boers turned a British invention against its creators with clinical precision. It was a scaled-up monster, a 37mm variant of the Maxim. The British military had already looked at the blueprints and rejected them. They saw no use for it. The Boers saw a predator. They bought the guns and gave them a name, the pom-pom. The sound of the rhythmic, heavy thumping became a death knell for the Empire. Boer commandos hid these machines near British artillery batteries. High-velocity shells tore through crews before they could even unlimber their cannons. The Boers proved the machine gun was not just a tool for colonial policing. It was an artillery killer. Despite the blood in the dirt, the great powers hesitated. Skepticism remained the standard response in London, Paris, and Berlin. Generals argued it was too expensive. A weapon that ate ammunition this fast would bankrupt a treasury in a week. Others called it a toy, useless for the maneuvers of modern, civilized warfare. They simply could not imagine a tactical niche for a gun that never stopped firing. The skepticism didn't last. One by one, the major powers placed their orders. Contracts were signed, and factories began to hum. Everyone felt a storm gathered on the horizon, though the true scale of the coming slaughter remained unthinkable. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the British Army officially adopted the Maxim into their arsenals. To conquer the plains of Africa, Maxim had to defeat a primary law of physics. He had to kill the heat before the heat killed the machine. Continuous automatic fire turns a steel barrel into soft wax. After a few hundred rounds, the metal deforms. The weapon chokes. How could he shoot for hours without melting the core? Maxim encased the barrel in a heavy jacket of brass and steel. He filled the void with 1 gallon of water. The mechanism was a violent ritual. The gunner pulled the trigger. The barrel recoiled. Inside the jacket, the water began to scream. It absorbed the white-hot energy of every explosion. After 750 rounds, the liquid reached a boiling point. How to stay hidden while the gun exhales a cloud of steam? A rubber hose ran from the jacket to a separate canister. The steam condensed back into water, silent and invisible. It was a closed loop of death. No rising white plumes, no revealed positions. The machine was an idol, and it demanded an entourage. One man could pull the trigger, but he couldn't keep the god fed. It took a crew of 6 to serve a single Maxim. 1 gunner, 1 loader, 4 others to carry the weight of the altar. The system weighed 117 pounds. That is the weight of a grown man. The crew hauled this iron corpse through mud and sand, along with belts of ammunition and spare parts. 1 man poured water, another guided the belt, a third watched the steam hose. If one failed, the machine died. It was the birth of the modern crew-served weapon, where the human became a cog in a 117-pound engine. Water cooling was only half the battle. In 1884, Hiram Maxim solved the problem of ammunition feed. He replaced the gravity-fed hoppers of the Gatling with a flexible fabric belt. 250 rounds sat in a single strip. They could be linked together. The fire became truly continuous. Maxim did not wait for the future. He built his prototype a full year before the invention of smokeless powder. He used black powder. It was dirty. It produced massive clouds of smoke and thick residue that jammed every other mechanism. Maxim's gun did not jam. He fired over 200,000 rounds through his prototypes with almost no failures. One machine replaced a platoon. Military trials proved a single Maxim gun equaled the firepower of 60 riflemen firing at once. The gun even featured a hydraulic lever to control the tempo. The shooter could choose any speed from 1 round per minute to 600. It was a factory of lead, fed by a 250-round belt. Maxim looked at the bruise on his shoulder and saw a power source. For centuries, recoil was the enemy of the marksman. It ruined aim. It fatigued the body. Maxim decided to make the enemy work. Who recharges the weapon? The physics of the shot itself. The patent of 1883 changed everything. Maxim captured the violent energy of the kick. He harnessed the gas and the rearward punch of the bolt. The cartridge fired. The barrel recoiled. The mechanism extracted the brass, chambered a new round, and locked the breech. A mechanical cycle was born. Human muscle was no longer part of the equation. Before this, recoil was a waste of kinetic force. Maxim forced it to become an engine. The operator became a mere observer. Hold the trigger, the machine does the rest. Between 1883 and 1885, Maxim built a legal fortress around his genius. He patented every method: gas, recoil, and blowback. He left no room for rivals. He owned the very concept of automatic fire. Before Maxim's elegance, mechanical monsters ruled the battlefield. Richard Jordan Gatling didn't build a weapon, he built a meat grinder. The machine stood on a heavy artillery carriage. It was massive, clumsy, a brass and iron beast that looked more like a cannon than a rifle. To fire it, a soldier had to turn a side handle. The motion was rhythmic, steady. It felt like grinding coffee or operating a grain mill. The sound was a relentless mechanical screech of rotating steel. 6 barrels spun in a circle. Each turn performed a cycle: load, fire, extract. One barrel fired while the others cooled or fed. Was it a true machine gun? No. It was a high-speed manual labor device. The rate of fire was incredible for 1862. One man could now do the work of 100. Major powers watched with suspicion. They saw the potential but hated the weight. The Gatling gun was a prisoner of its own size. It couldn't follow infantry into the mud. It stayed behind with the big guns, waiting for a target that stayed still. The world waited for something lighter, something that didn't require a hand crank to kill. Hiram Maxim was already watching from the sidelines.